This is going to introduce particle systems. And the goal is to get a bunch of these daisies on two different layers as particles flowing throughout a moment. I'm going to create a new composition and call it the final. 1280 by 720 because it's a demo video. Let me zoom into this. Particles need to grip onto something such as a solid layer. So create a new solid. You can see there's a solid here by just clicking on the alpha. So that lets you see that there's actually a solid layer out here on the canvas. I'm going to reset its transformation, and now it's in the center. Search for a CC particle world and drag that out onto the solid, either here or onto the layer right there. Turning off alpha. If you hit play, you'll see a bunch of particles. Congratulations. Let's understand these particles a little more and control them. And of course, replace the particles with our daisies. Going from top to bottom, guides and grids are the visualizations that help you understand where your particle is in space. So you can turn them on and off. This isn't going to influence the particle at all. It's just here to help us understand what's going on. The producer, I know I skipped a little, is the actual emitter. How big, where is this emitter, the place where the particles are coming from within the 3D space. Okay, now going back up here. Birth rate, how many particles per? If I have 0.1, a lot less particles. 10, whole bunch of particles. So that's birth rate, and you can animate the parameters. Let me set that back to 2. Longevity, how long does each particle exist within the scene? If I have 0.1, it's this burst-looking object. This is very cool on its own as a special effect, 2D, 3D effect. Remember longevity. I'm going to increase longevity back to, let's say, 2. Anytime you can hit reset to put the default values up here. Producer, that deals with where the particles are coming from. Along the x-axis, y-axis, up and down, and z-axis into and out of the screen. So higher numbers away from the virtual camera, negative numbers into the screen. Radius, how big is the area emitting particles? So along the X, Y, and Z, you can control that. Go leave it at the defaults. Physics, and this is the fun one. It describes the behavior of the particles after they start. Right now it's explosion, and you can play with the different ones. Directional, whether it's an afterburner from a rocket, imagine a rocket right here, or maybe a water coming out of a hose. So play with the different types. Here's a fountain. And explore what works best for you. Fire is this upward push of the particles. It's another video I have that goes over making realistic looking fires. Remember, particles are just the base and not necessarily the end result that you're looking for, though we could do a lot with the particles themselves. Usually you're layering on effects, swapping in what these particles are for different textures to create a more visually designed look to your particle system. If I play with the next number, velocity, down to 0, we have it going straight up, and I can switch back to the explosion. So velocity of 1 or 2 gives you that burst, that push of the particles away from its center. So setting velocity down to 0, gravity is taking over and just pulling the particles straight down. Speaking of which, gravity, 0.5. With no gravity, we just have this ball of particles accumulating in the center. That could be an interesting effect, especially if you're into pixel art. Let's add some velocity to this. And now it's kind of, hey, look, we're doing a 1960s warp through space. Without any velocity, particles just exist like the sun and go nowhere. With velocity, we're pushing them out from the emitter. Adding gravity, 0.5, will tug those particles down. 20, back down towards a stream. And of course, you have negative numbers. So it could go upward. Gravity is a force that yanks the particles in a particular direction. Let me set that back down to 0.5. And resistance to the force. So now your particles are just cascading like this, which is fun. That looks awesome. The extra, I usually turn it off because you can set gravity and everything down to 0 and there's still a little wiggle happening. So if you remove the extra, it'll help you control things. Let me increase the velocity to 2. And no resistance. A little too much for our screen. Down to 1. Turning on the floor, with no action on the floor. And what's the floor? Well, going back under your grid. Let me stop this. There's the virtual floor. It's a plane going throughout your scene. If I turn on floor action, ice, cube, or bounce, let me do bounce because that's always fun. You can see that the particles are bouncing. If we slow down this system, you can visualize maybe snowflakes coming down from the clouds and bouncing on the floor. So that's bounce. Ice will make them slip. And that could be something like arc welding and glue. And that's another fun one. Imagine you have a bunch of logos, you want to stick them to the floor. That's glue. Look at them sticking right down here. Because you have your raindrops fall from above the scene. Let me reposition this as I say this. So I'm going to move this upward. As long as there's enough longevity, and this doesn't have enough longevity, so go into longevity. So given enough longevity, you can have the rain cascading down and the raindrops on the floor, and then they slowly disappear. This is how you work with a particle system, a little interactively, where you have your story that you want to tell, you have your design that you want to tell, and then you're fine-tuning the numbers, the different parameters, to get that look that you seek. Okay, we just have a few more of these parameters to go through. I'm leaving glue on. So that's going to be fun. Now, the particles themselves. Do you want them to be stars? I bet you can imagine some cool uses of this. We're almost up to the part of colorizing these things, but more likely you'll use your own textures instead of the default particles. This could be fun, and I've used this a lot in 3D space to emulate dust particles or cloud particles in outer space as you zoom through your logo space. So the faded ones, they just fade out on the outside. It's a very nice visual effect. Looks a little blurry. To go through this, I recommend going through the particles palette from top to bottom and exploring, thinking about what creative uses you can have for each one of these parameters and adjusting them. I'm not going to go through all of them. This is a good one. Maybe you need something that shatters or something origami in shape. It could be a very interesting visual. Going back to lines, and I'll come back to texture. And before I go to texture, there's the opacity, 100% opacity. what's the max opacity of, remember, in motion design, it's not always about being bold. Sometimes we have to be a little softer with our visuals. Under opacity map, this is the birth to death, and we could adjust this with the pen tool, and we could do this with a line like this. Let's set it back to something like this. All right, birth color, the color at the start. Maybe you want very light particles. Maybe you want them to start out red. Your choice. And the indication that your particle's about to leave this universe of After Effects, the death color. So that's the basics. And now let's go back to, let me set this up to white there. Let's go back to the beginning where I want some textures to show up instead of just the particle lines. Do that. I already have this daisy right here. That's my daisy comp. That's both layers on. I'm going to use one at a time. So this is daisy 1. I'll call this comp daisy 1. Going back to the final scene, go to drag daisy 1 down here. And then I'll hide it. But let me leave it up on the screen for a few moments while we'll get the effect in place. Going back under particles, particle type line, I'm going to select textured quads, which is a square. And now allows you to use the textured layers. So my source layer is going to be daisy 1. Now I'll turn off this daisy 1 comp, this big daisy. Instantly, you have a bunch of daisies flying down and doing their thing on the ground. So that's how you add textures. And under physics, you can start experimenting with the different parameters to get different results. And you also can experiment the type of physics from explosion to twirls to other ones until you get your desired effect. And there's a brief introduction to particle systems and texturizing your particles.